biography Betty Shabazz, a remarkable story of survival and faith before and after Malcolm X. This talk lasts an hour, 15 minutes.
Well, we're here at Sisterspace Books at 15th and U. This fantastic bookstore that I've been hearing so much about over the last few years. I guess they've been at this location for 6 years. I'm Russell Rickford. I'm the author of Betty Shabazz, A Remarkable Story of Survival and Faith Before and After Malcolm X. That long subtitle wasn't my idea, so. But this is the first, I guess, serious biography of Dr. Shabazz, who, as some of you will remember, passed away in the summer of 1997, tragically in that fire that was actually set by her grandson, who was an adolescent. I think it was around 13 at the time. He is the son of her second daughter, Kabila, and she has 6 daughters. Let's see. I am 28. I started the book when I was about 25. So it was certainly a struggle being young and being a man and being a non-Muslim, dealing with some of these, some of the communities in which Dr. Shabazz moved and some of the circles in which she moved. Certainly there was, I think, a degree of skepticism or certainly caution about who is this guy trying to do a story about Sister Betty, Dr. Betty. Eventually I think I overcame that because people figured out that, okay, this brother's motives are actually honorable and he's really trying to do a good job. And then they realized that I knew something about Malcolm. I didn't know nothing about Dr. Betty, but I knew a lot about Malcolm, and I was willing to do the work, the research. Initially, I actually agreed to do the book. In 2000, I had done a book with my dad on Black English titled Spoken Soul, the story of Black English, basically about Ebonics. And out of that, my agent I had with that book, he introduced me to this idea of doing a book about Dr. Shabazz. And I agreed because I was so into Malcolm. I always had been into Malcolm since I was in high school. I think like a lot of brothers and sisters of my generation, we were attracted to Malcolm in the late 80s and early 90s. You know, hip hop started sampling his speeches, and you started hearing him in a lot of rap songs. And I think one of the reasons was that, well, there was several different reasons. I mean, basically at a time where we felt like there was really a crisis of black leadership. There wasn't a lot of very strong black leaders speaking out for the issues that were important to us. Here was a voice and a message that we could really attach ourselves to, you know, that it felt like he was speaking to our needs. In dealing with neoconservatism and the Reagan presidency and the Bush presidency and white racism and how it just kept going and going. So in any case, I think that what I discovered in researching Dr. Shabazz is that it was a mistake to approach her life just in terms of Malcolm, okay? Because when I started, I was really looking at her almost as an extension of Malcolm. And I was seeing the value of her story in terms of getting to know more about Malcolm's family life, and then, by extension, learning more about his political ideals. Pretty early on in the research, I realized that that wasn't going to work, that this was a compelling, valuable story in its own right, that she was a fascinating figure in her own right, and that her story needed to be paid its respect, and I need to give her her due. And once I figured that out, I think it was a lot, I'm not going to say it was easy, but certainly I understood maybe the significance of what I was trying to do. And so I think what her story, I mean, the telling of her story, I think, fills an important gap in black history, in women's history, in American history. I think that in many profound ways, the story of her survival after Malcolm's assassination in '65, she lived from '65 to '97, really mirrors a lot of the both the victories and the defeats and the crises in the black community and black leadership and what's going on in black neighborhoods, black urban neighborhoods. All of those good, bad, and ugly is reflected in her story and the story of her family. So let me start reading before I mess around and talk too much. This first scene is from Valentine's Day, 1965. This is a week before Malcolm's assassination. Sister Betty and Brother Malcolm have been married at this point for 7 years. Okay, they were actually married January 14th, 1958. So this is night of February 1465. Betty and Malcolm sleeping soundly. He had flown in from London, worn and edgy, and had gulped a sedative. She had tucked in the children and gone to bed, slipping beneath sheets and layers of fear. Malcolm was slumbering upstairs in his study that night, as he often did. Betty had gotten so many threatening calls that day that she wondered whether she was having a nervous breakdown. More horrors lay ahead. At 2:45 a.m., fracturing glass and an explosion shattered the night as the first Molotov cocktail hit. Within seconds, black smoke was churning and orange tentacles of flames were skimming along the floor and flitting up the walls. Malcolm was vaulting out of bed and pounding through the house toward the children as the second firebomb struck. Betty, leaden with pregnancy, she was pregnant with twins at the time, staggered into the hallway and found herself near the kitchen door. She heard the thud as a third Molotov cocktail glanced off a rear window and fizzled. "Get the girls," she thought, but the linoleum seemed to have swallowed her up to her shins. Then Malcolm was flinging open the back door and barking at her, "Stay here." He plunged into the clotting smoke, scooping up shrieking children, the older three from a bedroom beside his and Betty's, and Gamila from her crib nearby. In an instant, he returned and deposited them at Betty's side. Their incandescent faces jolted her from her trance. Still in her nightgown, she hustled the bawling girls into the yard. Again, Malcolm bounded into the house, now for some of their belongings. Soon, he re-emerged in his underclothes and a singed overcoat, joining his wife and children in the frigid darkness. They stood there, coughing and shivering, their eyes stinging as firemen battled the leaping blaze. The flames would incinerate almost half of the uninsured house. But its occupants were alive. Kabila, who had been the first child awake and whose screams may have roused her parents, sobbed beside her sisters. She was 4, the age Malcolm had been when white men torched his family's Omaha, Nebraska home in 1929. It was an episode he described in his autobiography. "I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots," he wrote, "and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the 2 white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other trying to escape. My mother, with her baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks." Now, 36 years later, it was Betty who struggled to comfort her children as flames swallowed the home they had only just escaped. "I was almost frightened by his courage and efficiency in a time of terror," she later said of Malcolm. "I always knew he was strong, but at that hour I learned how great his strength was." The minister was so composed that even his eldest daughter had not fully grasped the danger. "My mother's like that too," Atala later said, "together." But Betty never forgot her own paralysis. She had been useless as a corpse in the few precious moments that might have meant her children's lives, and she vowed never again to freeze in the face of danger. Numbness, however, yielded swiftly to rage. "I couldn't imagine anybody being that cruel," she said later. "I couldn't imagine that anyone who claimed to love black people could do something like that." She wondered how an order that preached love for God, race, and family could so despise a man who honored all three with body and soul. Malcolm thought it was the black Muslims too. When a reporter screeched onto the scene and asked whom he thought had torched the place, his only reply was a peal of bitter, half-crazed laughter. The Malcolm followers, ushered a distraught Betty and her daughters to the house of Ruby Dee's brother, Tom Wallace, a dear friend and OAAU member who lived nearby in Queens. Malcolm did not accompany them. He was scheduled to speak in Detroit later that day and spent the next few hours preparing to catch a morning flight. He could almost hear the countdown to his death, but he was determined not to bow to his enemies. There was still much to say and do. Having barely escaped death by fire alongside her husband and daughters, Betty discovered that Malcolm planned to keep his out-of-town speaking date and flew into a rage. This last injustice charred whatever sliver of her composure had survived the flames. Later that Valentine's Day, a fatigued and tormented Malcolm stood before a Detroit audience in clothes that reeked of smoke and proclaimed that the bombing had not sapped his resolve. Quote, "Because my wife understands, and I have children from this size on down, and even in their young age they understand." But neither Betty's fear nor her fury had kept the minister in New York. So I think in that passage there are some signs of some of the strains that the marriage had gone through, particularly in that last year after Malcolm broke with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and went off on his own. There was a lot of pressure from the black Muslims. There was a lot of heat, of course, from the FBI, the CIA, the intelligence community. And Betty was dealing with all of that pressure mostly on her own because Malcolm has spent most of that year overseas in Africa and the Middle East. I think he always felt guilty for not being the husband and father that he would have liked to have been. And certainly, this was a source of deep pain and trauma for Dr. Shabazz. So a week after this episode with the firebombing, Malcolm is assassinated before Betty's eyes. But I think it's important for us to remember that she had suffered a lot of trauma and a lot of pain even before the assassination. Even though there are signs that there were some happy moments in the marriage, you know, Brother Malcolm was almost never there. She was dealing with a lot of pressure. She was dealing with the sexism of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's own, you know, sexism, and also he was an authoritarian leader and in many ways an authoritarian husband. Let's see. I want to read you something from just a few hours after the assassination.
Did you ever get any kind of indication of what her relationship was with the other women within the Nation of Islam?
It was strained.
What kind of
It was very strained. I mean, I think that, you know, being the first lady, and in a sense she was the first lady. I mean, you know, of course, Elijah Muhammad is the leader, and so his wife, Sister Clara, I guess formally would be the first lady. Malcolm was the most popular minister, and Malcolm was a brother that in the black community was widely known, especially after '59. And certainly after '59, he was most known in the white mainstream, in the media, on college campuses, this sort of thing. So the point is that she was the sister that they loved to hate. Now, there are other reasons for that tension. I think that she had a very strong, forceful personality. So she was dealing with the patriarchy of the Nation of Islam, with their chauvinism. She was dealing with, you know, jealousy from the sisters. Later on, she would tell her daughters about some sisters would come by the house with a bean pie or something. Oh, we just baked this. We know how Minister Malcolm likes this pie, and you know. So she was very suspicious of that. Now, some sisters in the nation who I talked to thought that she was too suspicious. But you have to understand, with all the pressures that she was dealing with, taking care of those children, her husband away overseas all the time. And I mean, Malcolm was ascetic. I mean, we know, for instance, there's been information that's come out about Martin and other women, but Malcolm was an ascetic in the sense that he wasn't into that, you know, extracurricular activities, you know. But Sister Betty was still very nervous about that. And there were a lot of problems with their own relationship from early on. Some of which stem from, I think, Malcolm's great suspicion about women. You know, Malcolm, he was one of the strongest preachers in the Nation of Islam, talking about protecting sisters and talking about kind of the purity of black women. But it was kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, sisters were supposed to be so pure and untouchable and, you know, the paragons of womanhood and ladyhood. But on the other hand, he wanted them to stay in the kitchen, stay raising the children, you know. And this was a time just before the feminist movement and black womanism and Africana womanism, everything that happened in the early 70s, late 60s. Sister Betty could have been very much part of that. She was educated, much more educated than most of the sisters in the Nation of Islam. When she married Malcolm in '58, she had a nursing degree. She'd been to Tuskegee. She'd been to nursing school. And so the fact that he would not allow her to work was another one of the I think, crises of the marriage. I don't want to portray him as just authoritarian, and I don't want to put all the problems in the marriage on him, because certainly I think her personality, both her, I think, legitimate desire to work outside of the home and to express, the talents and the knowledge and skills that she had gained in school, and also her forceful personality, her will to be an independent woman. Malcolm wasn't having that. So let me read briefly this passage that's happening a few hours after the assassination. At the Wallaces, this is a friend of the families that lived nearby. At the Wallaces, the smell of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen, where women were fixing drinks for the mob of visitors and the evening meal for Malcolm's family. A woman crouched with 3 of the Shabazz daughters in the dining room, quietly helping them practice the alphabet. Attallah ventured into the living room and found a newswoman. Settling by her side, the intent child showed the grown-up how to teach her children the alphabet. The reporter obligingly printed her name. With finicky block letters, the girl did the same. "This is for you to keep for your own," Attallah told her. "Don't forget to teach the children." The phone jangled, puncturing the children's susurrations and the grown-up's staring silence. A small TV set blathered. On the couch, surrounded by the survivors, including 4 of the men who had sworn to defend her husband with their lives, sat Betty. She looked at a journalist friend nearby. "They've taken him away from me, Mrs. Wilson," she said, her eyes wide as wounds. Later that evening, with the cordon of her husband's stunned disciples beside her and her 2 eldest girls nestled at her side, Betty watched the television review of the minister's stormy life. Malcolm glinted on the screen, unconquerable again. It was too much for the widow. She found her feet and wandered into the kitchen. A strapping man nearby whispered, "Tell him like it is, Brother Malcolm. Tell him like it is." Betty stood staring at the wall. "Is Daddy coming back after a speech, Mama?" Attallah asked. The widow wrapped her arms around the child as her head dropped near the refrigerator. 4-year-old Kabila tugged at her mother's skirt. "Please don't go out, Mama." Betty guided the girl's head into her lap. "I won't go, baby," she said softly. Ella Collins, this is Malcolm's older half-sister, eyed her sister-in-law, a woman almost 20 years her junior, from somewhere nearby. Suddenly she was proud of Betty and the grace with which she had soothed the children. Kabila was the only Shabazz daughter who seemed to realize that her father was not coming home. Attallah had expected Malcolm to spring to his feet after he toppled onto the Audubon stage. He had once assured her that the gunned-down cowboys on television's Bonanza were only pretending to be dead. But Attallah was starting to understand. Before sleep overtook her, she plopped down with her marker and scrawled a note. "Dear Daddy, I love you so. Oh dear, I wish you wasn't dead." Meanwhile, Betty huddled with photographer and writer Gordon Parks in the kitchen. She told him that she'd been ready for her husband's death. She was ashamed that she had cried over him when he was lying there all shot up. "He was always away," the widow said, "but I knew he would always come back. We loved each other. He was honest, too honest for his own good, I sometimes think." Gordon Parks started to wander off. "I only hope that the child I'm carrying is just like his father," Betty added. "I hope you get your wish," Parks said. Later that night, the widow prepared to leave for a meeting with Sutton, Percy Sutton, who with his brother Oliver would offer solace and legal counsel in the days and years ahead. She gritted against tears, offering a few farewells to the congregated visitors as she headed out the door. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "Goodbye. I am deeply touched." Sutton was beside her when, swathed in grief, she arrived at nearby supper club in East Elmhurst. She lingered for a minute or two before the row of reporters, tearfully recounting her husband's ominous wake-up call that morning. Then Sutton took over. "Malcolm X died broke," he announced. He said the minister had pumped every penny of his outside earnings into Black Islam and into his Muslim and nationalist camps thereafter. The succinct media conference wrapped up, and Betty was moving again. She wanted to surrender to the shadows, to let the creeping paralysis engulf her, but the fears of the dead and the living clamored for her attention. Later on that fall, Sister Betty gave birth to twins, Malika and Malak, bringing her children to six daughters. And This was a rough time because, you know, as I said, Malcolm had been broke. And she had urged Malcolm to put aside some money for the family in the years in which he had been the top minister for Elijah Muhammad. But Malcolm always refused, saying that, you know, the messenger will take care of us. The messenger will take care of us. And Sister Betty, I think, was suspicious of Elijah Muhammad's motives and his personal life long before Malcolm would allow himself to see the truth. So as a result, there was no money after Malcolm died. There was a few $100s in a bank account. And there was a group of women, including Ruby Dee, Juanita Poitier, Sidney Poitier's wife, and a few other sisters, mostly middle-class Christian sisters, prominent sisters, actresses and activists and this sort of thing, who came together and actually supported Sister Betty in those first couple of years. Without them, you know, who knows what she would have done. There was also, of course, a lot of working-class black folk who put $1 in an envelope, or $2 or $5. One brother sent some money, he said, buy milk for Malcolm's babies. So it was both this very small cadre within the black middle class, and also many, you know, more anonymous black working class people who made sure that this family survived. Interestingly enough, that fall, Sister Betty and the children moved into Mount Vernon, north of New York City, which was a black neighborhood, had many black neighborhoods, and she moved to a kind of a well-to-do neighborhood, black neighborhood. But there were a lot of tensions even for her, the wife and family of Malcolm X, moving into this predominantly black area. Mount Vernon did not want her, not black bourgeois Mount Vernon anyway. When Betty moved there, the community was very, very upset, her cousin Ruth Summerford later said. Most whites lived on the north side. The working class south side was largely black. But college-bred blacks were displacing whites in the Heights. A few years after the widow led her daughters into a corner house in the posh neighborhood, the local kids, without a hint of irony, took to calling the remaining white families pilgrims. Mrs. Malcolm X's new neighbors were dentists, lawyers, clergymen, and celebrities. Jazz diva Nina Simone lived 2 blocks away. Many of them cringed at the prospect of a notorious militant survivors in their midst. Would the newcomers sully the enclave and its middle-class integrationist sensibilities? Would Malcolm's daughters radicalize the children? Some of the brown Brahmins did not intend to wait and see. As the word spread in the fall of '65 that Betty and family were coming to town, there was talk of a petition to stop the sale of Bella Abzug's old place, and one or more gadflies began collecting signatures. Mount Vernon was no racial haven. As the Shabazzes were settling in, local NAACP pickets marched on City Hall demanding integrated schools and decent housing on the south side. Yet while white resistance to integration was an irritation for Mount Vernon's African-American middle class, a threat to respectability was a full-blown crisis. Most of the black professionals wanted nothing to do with Malcolm's legacy. Lawrence Otis Graham, a grade school classmate of Attila and Kabila, later remembered. Some of the elites spurned Betty, others ignored her. The first people who reached out to me in Mount Vernon were white, the widow later told a mentor. Black hostility and ignorance simmered throughout that first year. Kabila, said a society wife one afternoon outside the local private school the elder Shabazz daughters attended. What kind of a name is that? Another mother waiting for a child chimed in. I think it's Islam or Muslim, something like that, she said. Betty managed a frail smile and steered her girls into their designated seats in the back of the blue Oldsmobile she had inherited from her husband. There was white animosity, but it was the spite within her race that embittered the widow. Were these the Negroes for whom Malcolm had died? Nor was Malcolm's mystique less burdensome than his stigma. Some of the privileged blacks delighted in stunning black cronies with the news that Mrs. Malcolm X and company lived around the way. Few of the locals were openly malicious. Most whispered out of curiosity or anxiety, and the widow maintained a web of black support. Besides, chattering neighbors could not spoil the neighborhood's charm. Stately colonials squatted on hills and light traffic buzzed on shaded streets. Lawns were lush and rimmed with clouds of shrubbery and staircases unfurled from porches. Even the garages were airy. The black residents were lettered and their kids were college-bound. Drenched in ivy, the Shabazz house anchored East 5th and Cedar, which ended in a sprawling wooded area. Here was the upper middle classdom that Betty had longed for throughout her marriage, the kind of comfort Malcolm himself had known only during his wandering teen years with Ella Collins, a self-made member of Boston's landed black aristocracy. The widow later recalled that the assassination had left her life in bits and pieces. Mount Vernon seemed an ideal place to mend. The grief did not dissolve so much as slacken, only to constrict every night after the children fell asleep. They drove it away each morning with their clamoring for cereal, but the respites were brief and often joyless. That Malcolm was gone still seemed absurd. It was 2 years before Betty could bring herself to hang his portraits about the house. When we did put the pictures up, I thought that we had finally reached the point where we could talk about him without tears, she said in 1969, but now I doubt this will ever happen. The children were scarred too. They knew only that something terrible had happened, Betty later said. Attallah, Kabila, and Ilyasa had seen at least 2 attempts on their father's life, the firebombing and the actual assassination. The peril had seeped too deep into their consciousness for Betty to fully absorb. In the early years, the girls cried not just for their father, but out of a shattered sense of security. During trances that spooked her playmates, Attallah relived the flaming house and the tumult of gunfire. For years, she wondered if the army that had executed her father would return for the rest of her family. The girls, there were so many shots, they sounded to them like it was an army. As a second grader, she sometimes walked into the classroom and plunked down in her seat with her coat on, staring ahead blankly. After a while, she later said, you get to thinking, how dare they? How dare they take my father from me? Kabila would not confront that rage for years. On the 4th anniversary of her father's death, the precocious child, then 7, scrawled an essay titled Malcolm X, a black leader, on a 4x6 card and handed it to her mother. The details and grammar were off, but the sentiment was crushing. She wrote, Malcolm X was a brave leader. He fought for rights for all black people. His black preachings were in everybody's heart. In 1964, he was at the Audubon preaching, and everyone was listening instead of falling asleep, listening to his black word. Then, for not long, he was shot. He died, but his black, beautiful soul is in every black person's heart. This is in the early 70s, and actually throughout her daughter's early childhood, Dr. Shabazz really struggled to shelter them from a lot of different things, but mostly from, I think, some of the political legacies of her husband. She wanted to shelter them from the kind of radicalism because she knew what that radicalism had cost her family. The Shabazz daughters could not truly appreciate who their father was politically because Betty never told them. I taught them about him by me being disciplined and strict, she later said. My children think my persona is me when actually it is their father's. The children grew up among his relics. Many of the well-thumbed volumes in the family library had been his. His hat and suitcase sat in a closet. One found souvenirs from his travels in various nooks, and his bespectacled face peered owlishly from portraits on the walls. Still, the girls reached their teens with little understanding of Malcolm as one of the century's prescient revolutionaries. They had no clue, one of their playmates later said. In time, they realized that Betty was a symbol for people throughout the world. They were curious about her trips abroad and sensitive to the manner in which outsiders approached her. They watched her cachet of dashikis, African headdresses, foreign currency, books, gifts, and mementos from friends and admirers grow. Meanwhile, they clung to the vestiges of Daddy that they had always known, the stories and the proud sense that he had been utterly devoted to his people. Attallah, who had the clearest memory of him, was her sister's ligament to their father. She and Betty still spoke of him as if he had just gone out for a newspaper, Ilyasa later said. Yet Attallah could not talk about Malcolm the warrior, and Betty wouldn't. In my father's absence, my mother nurtured and protected the significance and value of her husband's endless devotion to human rights, the eldest daughter said. But though youngsters across the country were plunging into his autobiography, the widow never discussed the book with her children. Attallah was a teenager before she realized that she was more intimately linked to the characters in her father's memoirs than to those in the Swiss Family Robinson. Old friends would reminisce about him during visits, transfixing his daughters with tales of razor wit and charm or his boundless energy. The girls were hungry for ballads and parables and anecdotes. They never tired of listening to their father's character witnesses. Still, the narratives seemed biblically ancient and distant from their reality. Let me just briefly read, I think, one more quick passage. This talks a little bit about Dr. Shabazz's struggles with men and dating in the years after Malcolm. There were a few people that kind of were her escorts to different public events in the early years after Malcolm's assassination, but there was so much pressure on her to remain single or not to remarry or not to have a boyfriend. And also, she was very, very suspicious of any man or anybody really coming into the life of her and her children. I mean, she had to be. You know, I think, as I mentioned, the threats to her family did not stop after Malcolm's assassination. And now we know that the FBI did not stop monitoring Dr. Shabazz until probably the mid-70s or later. So almost 12 years after Malcolm's assassination, the FBI was still spying on Betty and the girls. Betty missed the girls, missed her daughters while they were away. But at times she was lonely, even while their giggles echoed through the house. She longed for Malcolm, for the enveloping warmth of belonging to somebody. Though she had arrived at social affairs with various escorts in her early widowhood, she had not seriously considered remarrying. I can't even think about marriage, because to marry would be to admit that Malcolm is really dead. And although I know he's gone, I don't want the break to be so final, she once said. She thought even a serious relationship unlikely. The girls, she said, occupied 99% of her time. Besides, she felt too damaged for romance. Her artist clique urged her, she used to hang out with some artists, including Nikki Giovanni. Her artist clique urged her to remarry to ease the grief, loneliness, and financial burdens. She just laughed. No one seemed to understand the force of Malcolm's lingering presence. For her, he was there, and his ghost drove off suitors. The saintliness of public widowhood and Betty's suspicion of those who hazarded advances made her no more approachable. For all her fierce independence, she also feared Black America's disapproval. "People don't want me to have a boyfriend," she once told Amina Baraka jokingly. It's Amiri Baraka's wife. Friends, strangers, and journalists were forever asking the widow if she was going to get hitched again. She allowed only a dim possibility in the distant future. For a time, she said no so violently that people wondered whether something had gone wrong between her and Malcolm. She may actually have declined at least one formal proposal early in her widowhood. A colleague later confronted her with the rumor that Muammar el-Gaddafi, leader of the Islamic State of Libya, had extended his hand to her as an act of chivalry in those lean years. "Could be," Betty replied with typical coyness, "but I'm not about being part of a harem." "My biggest fight is being alone," Betty once confessed. She kidded about the predicament. "Say, Rev, why don't the fellas flirt with me?" she asked a comrade. He pondered this for a moment. "I think you got this atmosphere about you that says, 'Look, but don't touch,'" he replied. Sometimes Betty could not laugh away the solitude. When the children were asleep or away, when she could not ring her female friends because the phone would wake their husbands, loneliness clasped her like a noose. "I wouldn't wish her life on anybody," Gamila, her fourth daughter, later said. "Is being married to my father 7 years enough to carry you for the rest of your life?" There were gentlemen callers, of course. One even managed to win her heart. Eventually, she broke it off. No doubt there were many complications, but it didn't help that he started smoking pot. Always a fetching and shapely woman, the widow began gaining weight. Food was a fleeting solace, yet nothing could soothe her a few years later when the man returned. He marched up to the front porch, rang the doorbell, and started pacing nervously. Betty was horrified. She thought she had grown fat. "I'm rushing to leave," she shouted through the door, then began crying softly. The visitor stood on the porch for a few minutes, staring at the door. Finally, he whispered, "Okay, Betty," and left. Faye, should I do one more? Should I take questions, or should I do one more quick passage? Or?
Any questions?
Let me do one more really brief passage that takes it a little bit, takes it into the 90s. Betty left an upstate New York fasting retreat the afternoon of the premiere with a supply of apple, beet, and carrot juice for the drive to Manhattan. What she really wanted was a glass of wine. She told herself that she could handle this. She did her deep breathing exercises. Nothing worked. I was going to see my husband, and I wouldn't be able to bring him home, she later said. The evening was a swirl of anxiety and anticipation. Finally, she arrived at the premiere. Diana Ross, Bobby Brown, Stevie Wonder, Whitney Houston, and Madonna traipsed across the red carpet. Yet Betty had eyes for only one star. My girls and I, we're going to see my husband, she said, and Denzel is he tonight. Minutes later, she was sitting in the theater marveling at Angela Bassett's portrayal of a young Muslim woman whose shimmering confidence enthralled Malcolm, a woman the widow did not recognize. She went straight to the bullseye, Betty later said of Bassett's character, chuckling at the idea that the minister would have succumbed to so forthright a woman. Then the more harrowing scenes began to roll. Betty felt her composure crumbling. Her hands began drifting over her head. Ilyasa caught them and coaxed them down south. "It's all right, honey," the third Shabazz daughter cooed. "I'm here." Serious Malcolmites lambasted the movie. Former OAAU man Herbin Ferguson groused that Spike Lee's Malcolm had wound up an accommodationist. First they assassinated the messenger, he said. Now they're attempting to assassinate the message. To Dr. John Henry Clark, the inattention to the minister's bond with Kwame Nkrumah and other third world revolutionaries was tantamount to making lemonade without lemons. "You have sweet water," the elder said, "but you can't call it lemonade." Still, box office registers were singing, as were black notables from Reverend Al Sharpton to Bobby Seale. "Spike Lee has made a great contribution to history," Jesse Jackson said, though he worried that mythology was clouding Malcolm's meaning. If Betty had similar concerns, she swallowed them. No movie could capture Malcolm, she said, but she called the Lee effort an excellent introduction. She dismissed charges that frivolity drenched the picture's early sequences. "Malcolm was such a serious subject that one might welcome a little lightheartedness," she said, recalling that satire had been central to her husband's pedagogy. She acknowledged that Malcolm X, the movie, was just a silhouette. "What can you show in 3 hours?" she said, yet she generally avoided appraising the film during interviews. Even this temperate stance, Malcolm X's appetizer, vexed some of the movie's detractors, including some of Malcolm's siblings, who saw the martyr's commodification as wholesale betrayal. Ella Collins, who was among those who charged Spike Lee with profiteering. Now a 77-year-old diabetic and double amputee living in a nursing home, she revived her ancient feud with Betty by questioning the widow's grasp of her late husband's politics. "Betty doesn't know enough about Malcolm to consult on anything," Collins said. "She would go to certain places and hear him speak, but her activities were very limited. She was having babies." "I don't have any respect for that lady," Betty shot back. Months before the picture's release, several of Malcolm's other siblings had also expressed to Lee their misgivings about Betty's association with the project. Betty paid the rumblings no mind. She was caught up in the reverie. Her Malcolm was back, and all of a sudden he was beloved. She had always sworn by the African proverb that says, "Call an ancestor's name every day and he shall live forever." Now the minister's presence enveloped her again. Wedged in Manhattan traffic one afternoon before the film premiere, she spotted a man in X regalia. "I like your shirt," she shouted, flashing a thumbs up. "Thank you, sister," the man replied with a grin. Betty ignored the symbolism versus substance debate that had embroiled the film. One of her allies thought that the picture's flaws ripped and tore at her, but the widow had never fashioned herself as a custodian of her husband's ideological purity and felt no obligation to distance herself from the spectacle of the Malcolm X movie. Betty had worried that the film would unearth her and the minister's domestic warfare or portray him, quote, like some wimp. She was unhappy that the finished product lacked scenes of the family man frolicking with his wife and kids, the benign figure she and her eldest daughters had so industriously promoted. But she was willing to abide more grievous historical flaws in exchange for the respectability and wealth that Malcolm X, the movie, would generate for her family and the glory that it would lavish upon Malcolm. She endured the frivolities of hero worship for a similar return. "So what? So what? So what? So what?" she said of the orgy of Malcolm X merchandise, insisting that the fashion craze would steer youngsters toward a deeper knowledge of her husband. "No one gets a book and starts at the last chapter," she said. In the end, she was right. Despite its failings, Malcolm X, the movie, revived Malcolm more powerfully than 1,000 street ceremonies and wove threads of his political thought into the orthodoxy of a new generation. This was Betty's year of Malcolm, and no one who knew her story could blame her for basking. She had sworn long ago that the world would someday celebrate him. Myrlie Evers Williams, the widow of Medgar Evers, phoned her the morning of the premiere to remind her of that pledge. "This is the day," Myrlie announced. "I told you," Betty said quietly, "and someday they will recognize Medgar." Thank you. Go ahead.
Was there a relationship between Dr. Betty Shabazz and Coretta Scott King that you know of, that you can speak of?
Sure. You know, I guess I had to go back to Malcolm. You know, Malcolm, for years, I mean, he didn't like any of the civil rights leaders. He thought they were all bunk, but the person who really got on his nerves was Martin, because he felt like Martin was pacifying the black masses when they needed to be more militant against attacks on the black community, black women and children, etc. Towards the end of his life, towards the mid-60s, Malcolm began to get, I think, more savvy about the role he could play vis-a-vis the civil rights movement, and the fact that some of the goals were not that different, their strategies were just different. And in fact, he started taking a more of a conciliatory stance toward King. I hesitate to say that because he still, to the end of his life, disagreed with King's objectives. I mean, King wanted, you know, integration and equal opportunity, when Malcolm really wanted the United Nations to charge the United States with violating black people's human rights. I mean, so he wanted Malcolm wanted black people in the United States to hook up with revolutionaries in the Third World to mount a kind of worldwide revolution against white supremacy and global oppression. But you'll remember that a couple months before his death, Malcolm actually went down into the South to speak to some of King's representatives. And he would have met with King had King not been in jail at the time. Betty, I think, in the late 60s and early 70s began, I think she first met Coretta in 1970. And they would meet at various public events. They would meet on the dais of national black political conventions in 1970 and 1972 in Gary, Indiana. And I think they were always, it was kind of a formality. They were fairly pleasant. Certainly they understood the importance of keeping up appearances, you know, and how important they were symbolically to black people and to the movement. But I think there was a lot of tension there, particularly felt by Betty. One of the biggest reasons was that, well, first thing we have to understand is that, you know, Coretta's experience had been totally different. Mrs. King's experience had been totally different. She had been almost universally embraced by America, by the world, really, after Martin's assassination. She had had the opportunity to kind of retreat for a while and to write her autobiography and sign a very, you know, big book contract to do so. Sister Betty didn't have any of those opportunities, those privileges. She was still fighting for her life and the life of her children. And Malcolm was seen in the mainstream and by much of the black establishment as a pariah. So in the early 1980s, when, for instance, the movement to make King's birthday a holiday really started getting going, and when they finally signed the legislation, ironically under Reagan, Dr. Shabazz, at that time she was a doctor, she wanted for Malcolm all of that admiration. And she, you know, there was always a group of people within the black community that loved Malcolm. There was, I mean, and mostly it was people, working class people, people in the urban north, radicals, young militants, young intellectuals, young artists, who, for them, you know, he was their hero. But Malcolm was never universally embraced by black people, even though I think many people in the black middle class, his idea resonated with them, and they were kind of secretly like or admire some of the things he said. But Betty wanted respectability. She wanted it for herself, she wanted it for her daughters, and she wanted it for her husband. And so that, I think, was a source of some of the tension between them. You know, this one activist I talked to talked about how in the earlier mid-'70s, Sister Betty and Mrs. King would be at the same event, and Mrs. King would have her whole entourage with her, and she'd have her speech writers, and she'd pull out her speech. You know, Sister Betty would be by herself pulling her speech out of her bag, and it'd be written on the back of a napkin, you know. Sister Betty and Mrs. King eventually became very close friends. But it didn't happen, I think, until, and I'm not sure if this is a direct correlation, but I think it helped, until Malcolm began to get more of the recognition from the mainstream, you know. Sister Betty would never, Dr. Shabazz would never live to see the Malcolm X postal stamp, although she campaigned for it beginning in the 80s. But she would have loved it, I think. I mean, because this is the type of recognition she wanted from Malcolm. Eventually, in 1995, I have a letter that Mrs. King sent Dr. Shabazz in 95, a couple years before Dr. Shabazz's death, in which Mrs. King says, hey, how you doing, sister? It's a very, like, you know, girlfriendly type of conversation. How you doing, sister? You know, it's been so long. Here's the hand cream I promised I would send you. Happy Mother's Day. And here's, you know, they always exchange flowers on Mother's Day. And Dr. Shabazz was so proud of that letter, she passed it around to all of her friends. And look what Retta sent me. You know, she was very proud of that. So eventually that relationship became really powerful. And it was very, Amiri Baraka told me that he remembered once being at some event. You know, they would go to these annual retreats or biannual retreats with a lot of, you know, black leaders. And Sister Betty and Mrs. King sometimes would be there. And one time they were huddling together in the corner. And he looked over and he was moved almost to tears, looking at these, you know, at these two symbols, these two icons, and thinking about the fact that their husbands never were able to get together, even though in many ways they kind of wanted to. They were still suspicious of each other, but they were both cut down before they could get together. But their widows ended up getting together, and that was very meaningful.
After the assassination of Malcolm, you referred to her as the widow, I guess interchangeably with Betty. And I was wondering why she wouldn't just stand on her own as Betty or Dr. Shabazz as she requested after she earned her degree. I read your book, and I'm doing the article for Port of Harlem. So I'm going to talk with you, because I already talked to you on the phone, so I was just happy to meet you in person. But I wanted to ask you after I finished the book why she's always referred to as the widow and not so much as on her own.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I was very conscious. You know, the second half, a little bit more than half of the book is really about her life afterwards. And I think that's the substance of her story, and the substance of her persona and her legacy happened in those years. You know, she was very young when she married Malcolm, and she was 30 when he died. He was 39. I think I used the widow, well, one, it was kind of stylistically to break up, you know, Betty. And the other thing, I think consciously, to continue to remind readers of this, how profoundly this identity shaped her life and shaped her own identity. Now, her relationship to her widowhood, if you will, was not an easy relationship. I mean, she struggled with it. She struggled to carve out her own identity. And in the late 60s and early 70s, various groups would call upon her to show up, because having her there, they had like the, you know, implicit approval of Malcolm, or the implicit presence of Malcolm. She represented him so powerfully. For instance, the Panthers, when they were trying to make a name for themselves in Oakland, I think in '67, invited her to the Bay Area. And it was a big, big deal, because they picked her up from the airport with their guns and everything. She was scared to death. In fact, she had fallen asleep. She had fallen asleep on the airplane, and when she woke up and she saw all these men in the black leather and everything, she was like, "Oh, who they coming from?" She was like, she was mad at herself for having missed whatever, you know, celebrity, and then she realized they were there for her. So, but for her, guns were real. I mean, Malcolm had taught her how to use a gun, not to protect against white folks, but to protect against the black people who had already attempted his life, who were hunting him down, who had, presumably, he believed, firebombed the house with his babies inside. So she knew about guns, not because she wanted to. She'd grown up very middle class, grown up in the AME church, but this had been her experience. When she married Malcolm, she had no idea that she was going to have to deal with this stuff. She thought she was marrying a minister. She was marrying a minister. Like anybody else who marries a pastor of a Christian church, you think you're going to be the, Mrs., of the congregation. And she was to some extent, but she also in later years had to deal with the violent response to Malcolm's political message, in so many different ways. So, but I think that's an excellent point because, again, that relationship to public widowhood and what people expected of her was always tense. And it wasn't, I think, until the 80s, maybe even the early 90s, when for the first time she began to enjoy some celebrity. She was never up there with Mrs. King, but she started, because of Spike Lee's movie, she got nearer to that level. By that time, she'd figured out, this is how I want to move. And she became a very forceful, determined, committed, I think sophisticated, not leader, but figure. She never considered herself a leader, and she didn't want to be a leader. She saw what leadership had did to Malcolm. So she didn't want to be a leader, but she did want to serve black people. She did want to serve, in particular, black women, black children, women of color, around the world. So when she traveled around the world, as she did constantly, to various women's conferences, and particularly in Africa, this is what she wanted to represent. And this was, in some ways, a similar message that Malcolm, similar in the sense of the international consciousness, and which is what she always wanted to stress about Malcolm. But in other ways, it was very different. It was very much Betty's own contribution and her own sophistication. She went back to school, got her master's, got her EDD, studied the Organization of African Unity, which is the organization that Malcolm had patterned his Organization of Afro-American Unity after. So these were ideals that were very important to her, and she began to represent them in a very sophisticated manner.
I like how you took her domestic sphere, and even though it was very limited in Islam, I suppose, and in most religions, I mean Christianity to an extent also as a limited domestic sphere, but how she reinvented that after the assassination, and when the twins were in that daycare, and how she kind of went in and redeveloped. I really like that part of the story, I guess, as a black woman's activist of sorts, not on your level, Faye, but on another level. The idea that she was doing that, because that's a part of her life you never hear about.
Right.
I mean, I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and I guess I was really wanting more of a biography, but it wasn't. The way you have it titled is actually what it is. And so I said I really had to read. I said, read the title again so you can understand what the book is about. So I really enjoyed it, and you'll be able to read about that. In my
book. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, the part she was referring to in the late '60s, Dr. Shabazz began taking, I think, her two babies, the twins, to this daycare, and I think also probably Kabila, who was like 4 or 5 at the time, to this daycare. Predominantly black, working class daycare in Mount Vernon. And she began to have a bigger and bigger role, play a bigger and bigger role in this daycare, which is very kind of experimental. And it was her own kind of activism started to emerge in terms of, she saw some of the children acting funny, and she alerted the administrators that it might be lead poisoning in their buildings. She got some of her friends like Nina Simone to do concerts on behalf of this daycare. And eventually, Dr. Shabazz began taking on more and more kind of civic roles in terms of looking out for some of the young girls in Mount Vernon, when a lot of the teenage mothers, she had a class for them. So this she kind of considered her own activism. And it wasn't an activism that was going to put her in harm's way. She wasn't going to, catch no bullets behind. But this was critically important to her, and I think that as a young brother who was writing about this story and who came to the story, as I said before you came in, partly because of my attraction to Malcolm's masculinity and Malcolm's machismo, I had to understand that this is also a critical part of freedom struggle. Not only staying at home and cooking the meals and that kind of thing, which is critically important, but also holding the families together, teaching the children, passing on whatever ideals she interpreted her husband's life as representing to the babies, which Malcolm talked about before he left. So it was very educational for me as well. Go ahead, brother. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. How long did it take for the book to come into fruition, the research processes and everything behind it?
It took about 5 years, about 4.5 years.
You didn't have any difficulty getting information, did you?
Of course not. Of course,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I did. It was very tough because Dr. Shabazz had lived so privately because she had to, you know. Even at the end of her life, when she was in her late 50s or early 60s and was a very well-known figure, was definitely part of the black bourgeoisie, was a link, was a Delta, traveled in very elite circles, knew everybody who was anybody in black life. I mean, her address book, anybody you can imagine is in there. When she was getting invited to the White House for teas under George Clinton, I wish it was George Clinton. Under Bill Clinton, she still Freudian slip. She still would not discuss important business over the telephone or her personal life. She never discussed her personal life anywhere, really, but certainly not over the telephone. She always assumed it was tapped. She had had the experience of having her phones tapped by the FBI, and I'm sure she knew, like I said, you know, well into the 70s, that she was still being surveilled by the intelligence community.
Did that ever stop?
Who knows? I mean, from the records, it stopped in like 77. But you know, I mean, they'll only let you see so much, and they'll only let you see it 30 years later. So 30 years from now, who knows what they'll be uncovering about CIA and crack in our community? Who knows what they'll be uncovering? And that was another kind of conflict of Dr. Shabazz's life, because again, she did rise to that level of prominence. She was moving in those very elite circles. Certainly in New York, she was very close to David Dinkins, first black mayor of New York. But at the same time, she was never going to forget what the government had done to her family and to her husband. And she was never going to forgive it. Nor was she going to forgive what Farrakhan or the Nation of Islam had done. You know, there was that reconciliation, quote-unquote reconciliation, that she had with Farrakhan in 95, I guess, or 96. Late 95, early 96, at the Apollo in Harlem, where she shook his hand. He went to hug her, actually, if you look at the tape. He went to hug her. And Hakeem Atabudi kind of stuck his body halfway in between and ended up shaking hands. She had made it clear that she did not want to hug that man. She said, I am not hugging that man. She said thank you to him. They had planned the whole thing out beforehand. They had met at LaGuardia Airport in a secret meeting. And Farrakhan had his people with him. And she said, hello, I thank you for, this was after Kabila, her second daughter, had been indicted by the FBI in a very shady plot by the, or a very shady case for plotting the assassination of Farrakhan. And it's clear that, I mean, they do have her on tape talking with this guy, this informer, this slimy guy, who tried to entrap her. So she was talking about it. She was discussing it. And I'm not saying that the family has not been troubled. I know there have been a lot of troubles. But this was really, really a very traumatic episode for Dr. Shabazz, because everything she had fought to save her daughters from seemed to be coming back. You know, all the FBI, all the intrigue, all the heartache of the past seemed to be coming back up, you know. So even though there were so many victories and triumphs in her life, and her passage, I think, out of the movement and into professional life mirrors that of so many sisters who came out of the movement, most of them unsung, of course, but who played such a critical role in black liberation and civil rights movement, and then who had to find a way to enter professional life, find a way to go back and get degrees. So I think Dr. Shabazz represents that struggle, and I think that's why she was, for so many women, particularly women of color, particularly single moms, she was such a shero, because she represented that struggle, that transition, that evolution, that struggle to have your own identity, that struggle to take care of the children, to pass on you know, ideals to them, and in a way that was, in many ways, maybe even more, it's kind of silly to make the comparison, but even more profound than Mrs. King. Not to take anything away from Mrs. King's struggle, which is, I mean, amazing. God bless her. But the depths to which Betty had to climb out of, you know, or Dr. Betty, as I should say, is amazing. And I think so many sisters recognized that, and it resonated with them. Sure.
One more statement. I don't want to give the whole book away, but I didn't know the part about her being adopted either, or being taken in by that family, the Malloys. And I think that's a very interesting point, because when you try to explain how resilient she was, there was no family network outside of the two adoptive parents that she had. There were no siblings and no cousins that she was close to or were close to. So I think that really helps emphasize that she had to really steel within herself some, you know, sense of determination for herself and her children and her future.
Right. Well,
So
she did have half-sisters, 3 half-sisters in the Detroit area. But, I mean, like, so her parents were elderly. So her father had passed away before Malcolm's assassination. And her mother lived, I think, until her foster mother lived until, like, the late 80s, I think, maybe the early 80s. But she also had been somewhat estranged from them because, like so many brothers and sisters who joined the nation, when you joined the nation back then, that meant, you know, pretty much breaking ties with your family because all of a sudden you weren't Christian no more, and the Malloys said, well, you know, what's going to happen to your soul when you die, and this kind of thing, you know. So as much as Islam may or may not be accepted in the black community, or the Nation of Islam in particular may or may not be accepted in the black community today, certainly was much more foreign or exotic and scary for Christian black folks back then. So yeah, thank you for pointing it out.
Could you say a few words about the, whatever process you had to go through to get the book published? How did you choose your publisher? What was that about?
They chose me.
Because I'm especially concerned about some of the stuff that's being published right now for the African American community. I don't feel like we're seeing enough autobiographies and biographies,
Right.
and so I was just wondering, what did you have to go through to get this published?
It's still very seldom do black people write the lives of black people. So there's still, black biographers is still a very small group, and I mean, I was very blessed to have this opportunity. When I started doing the research, I went to Arnold Rampersad, who is a very prominent black biographer who did Jackie Robinson and Arthur Ashe, and is now writing a book about Ralph Ellison. And I asked him, how do I start? You know, and he sat me down for hours and talked to me very graciously. But one of the things he said is that, you know, there are very few black people that are writing the lives of black people. This is still very, I mean, it's amazing in one sense. And I mean, as we know, black people read. You know, white publishers discovered some time ago that black people read. I think the original contract was with a different publishing company in New Jersey, and they wanted, I think, a kind of a quick job on Dr. Shabazz. They had published a book, I think a little like coffee table biography of Diana Ross a few years back that did really well. So all of a sudden they discovered that black people read and that black women were worthwhile subjects. So I think they wanted something similar. I couldn't do something like that for Dr. Shabazz. The story is too important and too complex. So I actually spent a long time researching and writing the book. And eventually the contract got bought out by Sourcebooks, which is an independent house in Illinois. And, you know, initially they didn't seem to, certainly they haven't done too many black books before. They were very good. They stayed true to my vision. They didn't cut anything, and it was a very, very long manuscript. They wanted it to come in like at half this, you know, tops. The manuscript pages was stacked this high, you know, on the publisher's desk. But I had to fight for, well, I had to fight that hard. They really remained true to my vision. So as far as did I answer your question? As far as the process, yeah, it was a struggle, really, in terms of getting the interviews and finding the information, because Dr. Shabazz had lived so privately. And also, I was struggling within myself, like, am I worthy to do this? You know, I'm young and I'm a man, and what don't I understand about this woman's story? But I think, like I said, it was very educational for me And I think it was a blessing that a man was able to, and a young man was able to tell this story, because I think it's, you really get to understand a lot about the aftermath of the struggle, both about what real commitment to the struggle is and about what happened in the aftermath of the struggle. So, go ahead. Yeah. I don't talk to the daughters too often. I talk to Kabila every now and then, and I talk to Gamila. Kabila is the second daughter, and Gamila is the fourth daughter. Every now and then I'll see Ilyasa, the third daughter, because Ilyasa is up there in Mount Vernon working for the city. I think they like it. I asked Kabila the other day, I said, what do your sisters think? And she said, they think it's a good book. They think you did a good job. Now, obviously, they think there are things that they wish I didn't, explore. But I was committed to, I was trained as a journalist. I was committed to doing an objective biography, while at the same time, clearly it's a sympathetic biography. Clearly it came out of my deep love and admiration for Malcolm and my deep respect for the struggle, for Sister Betty's struggle. But, I deal with a lot of the crises that she had to deal with. It'd be absurd to tell her story and try and sanitize it, because it's a deeply tragic story. And I think a lot of the tragedy, even though in many ways she's unique, because, how many sisters have sat there and watched their husband been shot down in front of their eyes in the way that she did? But there are many sisters who have lost sons, husbands, male members of their family to violence. There are many sisters who've had to deal with suddenly being a single mom for so many reasons. There are so many sisters who've had to deal with, after they've raised their own kids, having to then raise with their grandkids, which is what she was doing when that fire killed her. So really understanding her story will teach you a lot about what sisters have had to deal with, in this country in the last however many years, maybe always. And the other thing is that when I first started doing it, there's kind of two ways as a young man of my generation, coming out of the hip-hop generation, you look at women almost like they're invisible, where it's just Malcolm and Martin, or it's the strong black woman who's this kind of like mythical figure who can leap a building in a single bound. Well, I realized that both models are actually not fair and actually erase the true woman. Sister Betty was strong, Dr. Shabazz was strong, but she wasn't always strong, and she didn't always want to be strong. She wanted to be vulnerable a lot of times, but she didn't have that privilege. I think that probably all women and all men can be as strong as she had to be. But doing so comes along with a great cost, And what was that cost? Well, it was a deep emotional cost. There was a deep spiritual cost. How did she maintain her relationship to God? How did she maintain her relationship with her daughters? And there was really a lot of struggles, So you can't just say, oh, black women are so strong, strong black women. Sisters have had to be strong, Let's look at some of the reasons why, and let's look at some of the consequences of black women having to deal with so much of the burden. And also, black women who have to deal with that burden, are there opportunities in our culture, in our community, for black women to speak about their pain, to speak about their trauma? And I think for so many different reasons, Dr. Shabazz found that there wasn't. I think part of that was on her because although she was trained as a psychiatric nurse, and although she counseled young sisters that were dealing with family crises to seek help, to speak out about their pain, she never did. And I think part of that really ate her up.
I was wondering, how did you obtain a lot of the very personal information? Like, okay, I'm with the Washington Afro-American newspaper. In fact, the Baltimore office sent me here, so we're doing it for both papers.
Fantastic.
And congratulations on your book. So I think I just opened it up just like this real quick so I could just look at
Sure.
something. And it was something very unique that I've never heard anybody else say about Betty Shabazz, and how how Malcolm liked to dance with her.
Yeah.
I thought that was nice, and
Right.
how he was very intimate. How he just like he was still that Detroit slim guy
Right.
in the house, but he was Malcolm X in public.
Right.
And the fact that how he treated her when his friends came over, how they had a certain kind of demeanor.
Right.
How did you get that in?
Well, a lot of that was, some of it was through interviews she herself gave later on, because she didn't talk about the marriage at all for years, but when she finally did, in different contexts, she had different strategies for memorializing Malcolm, as I call it. I think some of those memories are exaggerated, okay, because Malcolm was never home. I'm not saying that they never danced. I'm sure they did. I mean, because Dr. Shabazz could dance, and we all know Malcolm could dance. And Dr. Shabazz was very soulful, and she was coming out of Motown, Detroit. And, you know, Brother Malcolm, of course, loved jazz. And so they had that whole cultural side. But, again, he was a minister, and he was an ascetic minister. I mean, you know, he was a minister who was up before daybreak, read his 6 newspapers, had his meals specifically at a certain time that Betty had to cook for him a certain way. It was a very rigid lifestyle. I think part of talking about those memories, even though there might just have been a few, and if she might have embellished them a little bit, I think it was therapeutic for her, you know? And I think that she learned something that Myrlie Evers, I think, learned, who Myrlie Evers actually wrote the foreword. I think Mrs. Evers Williams learned a long time ago that the more you talk about this, the more you talk about some of that pain, you exercise some of those demons. It's therapeutic, you know what I'm saying? Mrs. King, for a lot of different reasons, was never able or willing to be as candid, even though she's written, you know, her autobiography. But Mrs. Evers Williams, you know, in her, I kind of remember, it's that the latest book or the second, I think it's not her last book, or the second to last book, she actually talks about a fight that she had with Medgar where they actually got into it physically, you know. And Dr. Betty and Mrs. King gasped, like they couldn't believe she had been that candid, because the unspoken word among the widows is, you know, you don't talk about, you know. But these were in many ways beautiful marriages and deeply strained marriages. I mean, like, you know, I'm single, but I imagine all marriages have both elements. And certainly when someone is this involved in the public eye and always on the road and this kind of thing.
I was also wondering about her Islamic identity, because she was, originally they came through the Nation of Islam, and then after Malcolm died, it was like nobody, I mean, you know how the Islamic community here in America went through different transitions. They went from, a lot of them went from the Nation of Islam on to becoming Sunni or Shia Muslims or whatever. But you never really heard too much about Betty Shabazz or her daughters in our community. We just didn't hear about it.
Right.
So what was she, I mean, was she kind of like, she had to remain a certain way because of who Malcolm was?
Right.
Or who was Betty Shabazz? Was she Muslim anymore? Was
Right.
she not? What was going on?
Right, right. Well, even before Malcolm's death, after they had left the Nation of Islam, when Malcolm converted to Orthodox Islam, when he visited Mecca, and he became Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Sister Betty also converted. She actually made her Hajj. She went on her pilgrimage a couple of months after Malcolm's death. So she actually made her Hajj. She fulfilled all 5 pillars of Islam. She gave alms. She recognized the oneness of Allah. She fasted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But she took off her head wrap. One of the reasons was that she did not want to look like she was in the Nation of Islam. She was very bitter towards the Nation of Islam. She didn't want to look like those sisters. Another reason was that she was very independent, and she lived by a very modern reading of the Quran. She did not believe in being submissive to men, nor does the Quran really say be submissive to men, but that's how, you know, men interpret it, just like Christian men. And also she went to church from time to time. She hung out with her Christian girlfriends. She stopped going to mosque. She went to mosque for many years in New York, but it was never really, she never rigidly, I think she maintained a relationship to Allah throughout her life. I don't see how she could have done what she did without that. But it was a very personal relationship and it didn't always manifest itself in ways that Muslims or non-Muslims were comfortable with, you know. And she would, you know, from talking to people, she'd cuss you out in a second if she felt like you were being rude or if you'd violated her. And because she'd built up that defense mechanism, she had to take care of herself and take care of her and protect her children. And I think part of that personality was there even before. You know, Malcolm talks about how his parents used to get into it and his father used to beat his mother. Well, Malcolm never, from what we know, put a hand on Sister Betty, but certainly they got into it. And certainly Dr. Shabazz, being an educated woman, just like Malcolm's mother, who was a prolific journalist for Garvey, she was very outspoken. So. Okay. Okay. And then
Do you know what is going on with her grandson now? Where is he?
Yeah. Well, I think right now he's actually still doing time on something unrelated. He is, by all accounts, a brilliant, I can't even say kid, he's a young man now. I think the New York Times recently did any of y'all see that New York Times article on him? Maybe a few months ago. They were talking about how, you know, all the inmates in prison, I'm not sure where he's doing time, but all the inmates were bringing him gifts and, you know, giving him special treatment because they knew he was Malcolm's grandson. But what strikes me when I never met the brother, I never interviewed him, but what strikes me when I hear about him is that, you know, I work with kids in Rikers up in New York, with young men, and he strikes me as very similar to those kids in the sense that he's brilliant, he's ambitious, he's misguided, he's troubled, he's confused, he's hurt, he's articulate. You know, the kids that I work with in Rikers are just like this kid. So in a sense, it's really one of the many ironies of the Shabazz story, because if you look at the autobiography and how Malcolm describes himself as a young man and how other people describe Malcolm as a young man, he was quick-witted, quick-tongued, you know, the same type of sharp, shoot-from-the-hip cat that I see in Rikers and that little Malcolm seems to be. So the question then becomes, you know, how do we deal with these children? I think that Dr. Shabazz was trying to answer that question, like so many grandmothers when she was tragically killed.
Did he have a mental diagnosis finally?
Yeah, he had a bunch of kind of sketchy diagnoses when he was very young, because he had problems even from the time he was very, very small. But they did formally, I think, diagnose him as schizophrenic and paranoid. He had a number of different things going on, that some of which his own mother had dealt with. And, you know, there's also a legacy of mental health issues on Malcolm's side of the family, too. So it's very, very complex, and of course compounded 100 times or 1,000 times by all the trauma that the family has endured. So the daughters are still, I think, struggling. The ones I talk to still struggle with a lot of these things. And they're still mourning, of course. So now Faye probably wants me to sign books.
Russell Rickford is author of Betty Shabazz, a remarkable story of survival and faith before and after Malcolm X. It's published by Sourcebooks. Visit sourcebooks.com for more information. The 9/11 Commission reported